Good evening. I'm Cory Siler, and I'm from the Narrative Intelligence Lab at the University of Kentucky, where I work with Dr. Stephen Ware. And my doctoral consortium abstract is called Open World Narrative Generation to Answer Players' Questions. Dr. Ware recently brought to my attention this point about Star Wars: A New Hope. The Empire wants to use the Death Star to fire on the Rebel base, but there's a planet between them and the target, and they wait for the planet to move, buying the rebels critical time to strike back. But the Death Star is designed to destroy planets. Why didn't they just blast through the obstacle? This is colloquially known as a plot hole, and in narratologist Marie-Laure Ryan's account is one possible result when human authors face a conflict between the needs of their plot and the rational behavior of their characters. In this case, between the authorial interest in the rebels winning and the Empire's interest in destroying them as efficiently as possible. Besides hand-waving the conflict, which is how Ryan classifies a plot hole, many narratives deal with the conflict, but in improbable ways, like stories where a character just happens to be in the perfect place at the perfect time to overhear an important piece of information, which Ryan terms a cheap plot trick. So what do we as the audience do when we encounter a contrivance like that? One reaction could be to reject the narrative, like, nope, Star Wars is ruined for me now. But that's not usually the case, it seems, as lots of people still enjoy Star Wars. If you're like me when watching the movie, though, you might not have even noticed something was off to begin with. Some contrivances are subtler than others. Or you may be thinking, hey, a planet-destroying weapon must be really expensive to fire. The Empire was just making it most economical use of its resources, which is a valid argument, and an argument that's not supplied to us directly by the movie, which illustrates the audience's imagination can be a powerful literary tool. My previous work focuses on a family of planning algorithms that generate plots, along with proofs that each character's actions satisfy a certain notion of rationality based on the character's beliefs and intentions. These algorithms can guarantee a logically sound story that entirely avoids the sorts of plot tricks I discussed before. But they have some limitations I like to overcome. For one, they're unable to generate the range of plots that human storytellers come up with, which allow for a little bit of contrivance and leave some of the explaining to the audience's imagination. Also, because everything must be explained explicitly, the planning process can be very expensive, and some of that expense goes toward verifying details that might not be noticeable to the audience to begin with. In my dissertation work, I'm going to stay in the realm of centralized symbolic planning, as opposed to, say, multi-agent systems or machine learning. But to overcome the limitations we discussed before, I'm going to alter some of the basic assumptions. Whereas the previous work focused on offline generation, where we use hard constraints to generate a plot that meets rigorous structural requirements, I'm going to shift to an active focus on interactive settings. Here, when we're asking about whether a story makes sense, we can observe the sense maker, that is the player. My work will center around designing narrative systems that understand and adapt to how the player is making sense of the plot. We can relax our usual constraints and allow for some measure of plot tricks, focusing on the soundness of the details that will matter to the player. Some of the work in our community over the past few years has framed interactive narrative as a conversation between the player and the author. Our lab is particularly interested in how each party implicitly asks and answers questions about the story world through their actions in the game world. My approach will use this implicit question asking and answering process to assess and guide player sense-making. Here are some of the basic assumptions that I'm making that will need to be examined empirically, but if they hold, they would underpin the value of a question answering based narrative generation architecture. One working hypothesis is that when players notice apparent inconsistencies, they will seek explanations. And conversely, player information seeking behavior can be used to infer when the player perceives a possible inconsistency. And furthermore, both of these are linked to the player having more unanswered questions or more urgent questions about the plot. If those relationships hold, I propose these three areas of focus for a question answering based narrative generation architecture. Modeling the player's knowledge of the story world, inferring the implicit questions that the player may be asking through their interactions with the story world, and then shaping the plot in order to answer those questions and guide the player's experience. I'll summarize the research questions my work going forward will try to address in each of these areas. As far as modeling player knowledge goes, the logics used for many existing player knowledge representations are monotonic. We assume a story world defined by a fixed set of variables, and as the player learns new facts, the set of possible worlds they could be in shrinks. But if we let the system invent new story world elements so that the story world is not entirely enumerated from the start, the set of possible worlds may be infinite. And then it makes more sense to consider what's plausible as opposed to possible. Now, plausibility, the difference being, is non-monotonic. When learning new facts about the world, the player may imagine possibilities that they hadn't imagined before and add those to their list of plausible worlds. Logics to model audience beliefs about plausibility in stories have been studied before, such as in Klassen et al.'s literary logic model, but not to my knowledge in the context of story generation. Now, for inferring player questions, how do we identify the questions most important to the player? As a starting point for this, I'll refer to Rom's account of question asking, where we have achievement goals, which are things that an agent wants to bring about in the world, but also knowledge goals, things that an agent wants to bring about in their own mental state. Understanding an agent's existing knowledge goals or the kinds of questions they are likely to ask involves understanding their prior knowledge, achievement goals, and other things that would make new knowledge useful. There's a work out there about inferring a player's achievement goals from their gameplay, but less about inferring the player's knowledge goals, and that's a direction I'm interested in investigating. And for answering questions, as the system answers a player question, it may raise new ones. This raises the risk of eventually ending up with too many questions or questions that are unanswerable while still being logically consistent, or going off track from other system priorities, such as accomplishing an author goal from the plot. Colloquially, we might call any of these incidences the system writing itself into a corner. One solution would be to develop planning algorithms that operate on our knowledge representation of the player to try to anticipate what new questions we'll raise later and how we can use them to guide the player in a plot-helpful direction. But given that the best of player models can't always predict player behavior, there may be more efficient methods than generating a plan that may be quickly foiled by the player. I'm going to turn to the feedback session shortly, so I wanted to point out a couple areas where it'd be most helpful to get the community's thoughts. First, a system that includes all the components I just described is a pretty ambitious undertaking. Does it seem like a dissertation can meaningfully touch on all of them, or would it be advisable that I find a tighter focus? Also, I'm only starting to try to figure out the best ways that the components that I talked about can be evaluated empirically, or what empirical claims I should be trying to make about them to begin with. That especially goes for the modeling portion, where I'm planning to study knowledge representations for player beliefs. I welcome comments on whether there's a good way to evaluate such knowledge representations in isolation, or whether it would need to be as part of a bigger system. And of course, thoughts of any kind are much appreciated. And I'd especially like to thank my doctoral consortium reviewers who provided a generous amount of helpful feedback in their comments. So much appreciated for that. And I'm going to open up to questions and comments.